Welcome everyone who is now just joining us via Facebook Live. We do have some people joining us via Zoom to today's small talk presentation, Missing from Collections, Gaps in the Transcona Museum's Collection.
Oh, we have someone joining in from Bridgewater Forest in Southwest Winnipeg, but grew up in Transcona.
Oh, excellent. So if you're joining us on Facebook Live, let us know where you're joining us from. Are you from Winnipeg, from Transcona? Or are you joining us from somewhere else in Manitoba or even Canada? We would like to acknowledge that the Transcona Museum resides on Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, as well as the homeland of the Métis Nation. We'd like to thank you again for joining us for our talk today and just ask that you think about supporting the museum. You can do this by making a donation or becoming a museum member, and that can be done on our website or in person at the museum. But you can also stay in touch, and that's another way of supporting the museum. So go to our website and see what we have on our website. Follow us on social media. So we're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube. We have a blog. You can join our mailing list. We send out e-newsletters once a month, and you might get maybe one other email from us during the month. We don't spam your inboxes or anything like that, but all of that is a way to support the museum. So once again, we are now going to be talking about missing from collections, gaps in the Transcona Museum collection.
So to start off, another individual joining us from Transcona heard about it from the Transcona Views. Awesome.
Hey.
So our first topic we're going to talk about is what items are already in the Transcona Museum collections. And we have about 50,000 plus artifacts on site here, plus our off-site 2747 steam locomotive. But our collection kind of runs for, we have textiles, we have natural history, ethnology, archaeology, material culture, which is kind of like our everyday,
those everyday items that you use.
Plus a very large archives, which includes documents and photographs and maps and
negatives and slides and archival elements. So newspapers, letters, programs, newsletters, things like that.
So if you've ever visited our building, wow, talking today. We're not a very large institution, but once you start adding up a lot of those small everyday items, and archival documents and stuff like that, it is very easy to understand how we have 50,000 plus artifacts here.
20,000 of those are a slide collection that we have. So that is a significant collection that we have. So the items that we do have in the museum collections, a lot of them are actually coming from the male perspective. A lot of the items in our collection, we have a large military collection of uniforms and military items from during World War I, World War II. Again, that is fairly male-centered. We have one female World War II uniform, and I believe it's Air Force. We don't have a female Army uniform. We don't have a female Navy uniform. We don't have any nursing from World War I or World War II. And we know of women who participated during not necessarily World War I, but World War II. But we only have that very limited element to our collection. So it definitely creates a gap. We also have a lot of artifacts related to local businesses here in Transcona. Again, many of those were male owned and operated. And so it's that perspective of Transcona's history. We don't have necessarily a lot that comes from the female perspective in our collection.
I'm just trying to think of like photographs as well, like thinking, do I tend to see more males in the photographs versus females in the photograph? And then kind of like, if you think about themes, what are women being depicted in versus what men are being depicted in?
A lot of the photographs we have in the collection that are showing sort of Transcona history events, new businesses opening, or the Board of Trade. It was essentially all men who are running the Board of Trade. So it's images of men who are unveiling new businesses coming to Transcona and things like that. So it's a very male perspective, and it is a white male perspective as well that we have here in our collection.
Oh, and then so we talk about sometimes the idea of the Transcona Historical Museum versus the Transcona Museum. A couple of years ago, we rebranded. We dropped the historical from our name. We went back to Transcona Museum, which we were originally known as. And we decided to do that because history is not just about old historical stuff. History is also capturing what's going on right now, what's been going on in the past 10 years. If you've seen any articles on museums in the news lately, they're talking about capturing COVID at this moment. How are people getting through this pandemic? So they're capturing history as it's happening. So that's something that we really wanted to, shift, is capturing current, present, happening history.
Yeah, I think one of the big reasons of dropping the name historical was I think people had this idea that we were only, and I'm going to use air quotes here, taking old stuff, the old items, where that's not necessarily true. And having conversations with people, we have for example, let's say a number of typewriters. We have typewriters, but what about, so maybe there was a woman who worked at a local business who used a typewriter. Okay, maybe her typewriter, or if there's any outfits that she wore, some of her wardrobe still around, any, her lunch kit that she might have taken into work or something like that, to have that female perspective. So, and again, it's not just the old stuff. There's things happening in our community. Our community is growing and our boundaries are changing, and the face of the community is different than what it was. So we need to also capture that, because our museum is to preserve and promote the community spirit of Transcona through sharing our history and stories for the benefit of all. So it's not just the history of Transcona, it's the community spirit of our community that this museum stands for, and what we do and everything that we promote. So we're taking that into consideration. And with museum comes older things. So it was sort of saying, it was almost seeming like it was putting a focus on the truly historical items of the museum, where, like Jennifer said, we're looking at what's happening today, what happened 5 years ago, even 20 years ago. We have very limited collections from essentially the 60s on here at the museum.
I think a great example was we did a technology-based exhibit a few years ago. So we had tons of the old tech, but we kind of had to supply some of our own items for new tech. I know my family had their old cell phones and Blackberries and stuff like that. So that's how we were able to incorporate new tech, because we didn't have that here.
But since then, we have actually gotten a few older cell phones, and to us today, these are older cell phones, but we've had some donated. We had a couple of things loaned to the museum for that exhibit from residents in the community, video game cartridges, and an old plug-in telephone with a cord, but it was in the shape of a car. So like really interesting, but we don't have any representations of that. We have one like sort of wall plug-in telephone, and it's a rotary phone. That's it. We don't have other examples of telephones even. And that's just like one small little category. Yeah.
So our next topic is missing versus storage. And when we talk about missing, we're not talking about it has gone missing from the collections. No. We mean it's a gap in the historical record here at the museum.
Yeah, so how can we best tell the full Transcona story, bring forth the full community spirit of this area if we are missing things? If we don't have elements to Transcona's history here at the museum. So while we have 50,000 plus artifacts and archival materials, there are significant areas where we are missing elements of Transcona's history. But catch-22, we have very little storage space for new items right now. We are essentially at capacity, but there are things that we still would like to have at the museum. One area where we do have a little bit of room is within our archives. There's a bit more room in our archives. I think we have a shelf and a half of space versus almost none in the rest of the collections area. So we always have to gauge new donations as they come in versus the space that we have for them. Because ethically, we have to care for these items for the long haul. We have to make sure that we can give them the proper care that they deserve. And it's not ethical for us to accept something into the collection if we can't care for it.
Mm-hmm. So for the most part these days, we tend to be taking more archival stuff as opposed to objects. But it's also a case-by-case basis, as you said.
Yeah, we've had some truly wonderful items donated in the past couple of years. One example is the first mayor of Transcona, his chair, was donated to the museum. And after the first mayor was
CJ Maxwell.
And he was only mayor for something like 6 to 8 months, and he decided not to run again. But the community really wanted him to run as mayor again. And so they decided to give him the mayor's chair to take with him. And the chair actually has a little plaque on it. So we know this is the chair. And we found some old reference to the community not wanting him to
give up the mayoral seat, so to speak.
Yes. So we were able to confirm that and everything. But that was one thing that we definitely made room for. Because it had such a significant part of Transcona's history. We don't have anything like that. Early mayors of Transcona, items like that. So we definitely accepted that into the collection. But it took some finagling to try to figure out where we can properly store this, where it's not going to get damaged. Mm-hmm. Oh, and we don't have any offsite storage. Some museums have separate facilities that are offsite storage. We don't have any. We have one artifact that is stored offsite, and that's the 2747, which is too large to fit in the building. It's bigger than our building. It's longer than our building, I believe. So everything that we have is stored here. Now, an option could be looking at in the future a potential offsite storage location, but then there's added costs associated with that. Security, rent. I'm thinking rent for another building, integrated pest management controls, knowing exactly where everything is. It's not just as easy as, we can store some stuff over here. The museum has been looking at and discussing a potential expansion of the building, and that has just sort of been put on hold until we have completed our 2747 preservation project, and then we'll revisit the idea of expansion. We tried looking at doing both of them at the same time, and that was just too much for our institution. But that's potentially something that we could look at,
down the line.
Down the line is some additional storage. There's also, looking at deaccessioning items from the collection. So that's removing things that don't fit our mission and mandate anymore to make room for things that do, which essentially most of the items in our collection are Transcona related. Initially, when the museum was being set up, there was a committee of people who went door to door, and they wanted just Transcona's history to add to the museum. But Transcona was only 50 years old, just over 50 years old when the museum was started. So there wasn't that much history to grab. So they did accept other things outside of Transcona's history. And some things we have that aren't necessarily Transcona's history, but they have that community spirit, they have that story. So they do actually fit within our collection. We just wished we had a bigger building and more room.
We really do. So what items don't we need at this point? First off, items that are already very well represented in the collection or duplicate items. So we don't necessarily need typewriters or sewing machines.
Unless it's a very specific, it has a very specific story. Essentially, what we're after is the history behind these objects, the object, but also its story. So to just have an object, it doesn't have as much value as an object with that historical information with it. So we could have a typewriter, or we could have the first mayor of Transcona's typewriter as an example.
Yep.
That one has more of a story that we can tell versus just a typewriter. We also aren't looking for things that are not related to Transcona or Transcona's history, or don't have a really solid Transcona story to them. Again, our mission is to preserve and promote the community spirit of Transcona. So everything has to come down to being from Transcona and somewhat surrounding Springfield area for sort of early years of the community. But essentially, there has to be a really strong Transcona connection. If it's not a strong connection, or we have something like it, we'll often offer up other museums that might be able to take these items to add to their collections.
We will not accept items with conditions or loans. Conditions being, for example, this item always has to be on display. And it doesn't quite work. We don't have a lot of exhibit space. So we try and rotate out our objects as much as possible. And that also helps with their longevity. If they're not, on display and in bright sunlight and under light conditions for prolonged periods of time, they're gonna last better than something that is. Loan items, we do not accept loans. In the past, there used to be things called temporary loans, which would be, say, for 6 months or 8 months. There was also permanent loans, which was the lifespan of the donor. The problem being with that, if the donor passes, the museum didn't always know. Mm-hmm. Family members didn't always come forward and say, hey, I found this paperwork that said that you have items of ours on loan. So loan items, unfortunately, they are not fully the museum's. They kind of exist in a limbo. We're looking after them long term. Some of these we've been looking after for 50 years, but they're not exactly ours.
No, they don't belong to us. There's a little caveat to that. Mm-hmm. Is sometimes we will actually take a temporary loan specific to a particular exhibit. So we know this exhibit will be 1 year in length, and we're asking for items from the public, very specific ones that are accepted to be on display for that exhibit, and then they are returned afterwards. Whereas previously, those permanent loans, we have a giant collections management project that we've been working through over the past few years, trying to even find some relatives of previous donors, executors of estates, so we can have these conversations of, are you willing to donate it to the museum, or would you like it returned? And it's tricky to do.
We definitely have a small talk all on that.
Yes.
So if you're interested in learning more about collections management work, we will do that talk again.
Yes. I think it's also on YouTube.
Not that one, no.
No, not that one. There is one about sort of the work that we do at the museum on YouTube. That one, I believe.
Yeah.
Another thing that not necessarily we don't need, but also we don't have space for, are oversized items. Again, our museum is quite small, and the question always is, where can we put this? An example is if there was like a City of Transcona vehicle that still said City of Transcona, that would be wonderful.
If we were a larger facility.
Right. We wouldn't be able to get that into the building. And if we were to get it into the building, we would have nowhere to store it. Oftentimes museums that have vehicles in their collection have much larger, they aren't necessarily a much larger museum than we are, but they have larger storage areas or buildings specifically for vehicles. And the idea of you could just leave it outside. Yeah, that's not ideal. We look at the 2747, which has been out on display since 1960, is definitely suffering due to just exposure to the elements. Currently, right now, it's being blast cleaned and repainted, and that's to remove rust and old degradation products that are on it, so we can have a really stable foundation for it till we can get a roof put over it. But we don't have the ability to store additional large things inside the museum, but even outside the museum.
Mm-hmm. Items that we cannot maintain or store in an ethical manner, we will not accept either. As Elena mentioned, not too recently, like we have to consider where it can be stored. Do we have the proper storage facilities to maintain, its temperature, its light, humidity, and stuff like that? If we can't ensure that, and we're talking, we need to ensure this long term, like 40, 50, 60 years, then it's not ethical on our part as museum professionals to accept those items.
It's also, we have to ensure that items that do come into the museum, the person who's donating them has the legal right to donate these items to the museum. Now, sometimes this might be the executor of an estate, but we have to make sure that the legal owner is the one who is donating these to the museum, so that we don't end up in a legal situation with a family fighting over a potential artifact or possibly stolen items coming into the museum's collection and things like that. So that goes into our ethics as well.
What items are we missing? First off, the female perspective, based on community history, military history, or workforce,
et cetera, et cetera. We have, I don't want to say this is like stereotypical women's perspective, but we have items that were used in the home, but that's not necessarily just like the female perspective. That's family life and things like that. But we know that women ran businesses here in the community. We know that women went out into the workforce.
We know women worked at the shops,
right? And that's one area where we have, I think we have three things.
I would say that's 2 or 3.
And it's archival of women that represent or show that women worked at the Transcona shops. And I believe it's images, it's pictures that show women working at the shops. We don't have their stories of what it was like. I take that back. We have one story of one woman who worked at the Transcona shop. She came in and she gave us an oral history, and she worked at in the shops 1950s, 1960s. So we have a little bit of that story, her story working there. Unfortunately, there were no artifacts that we have that also represent her time period of working at the shops. But in the 1980s, women started doing some of the labor jobs too, as well, at the shops. And we have nothing that represents that work. And there's women who work at the shops today, and we don't have any representation of that in our collection. Yes, we have tools from the shops, but none that have come to us from a woman who worked at the shops, or information saying a woman used this at the shops. So that's one area that we're looking for. Also, like the military history I spoke about earlier, we have one female World War II uniform, but nothing else. So a lot to do with the female perspective. The next is the Bank of Toronto. Our building is, our museum is let's try that again. Our building is the former Bank of Toronto building here in Transcona. We don't have any pictures, interior photographs of what it looked like when the bank was in this building. We have three. We have since found 3 art photographs of what the interior of this building looked like when it was the municipal office. We have a couple Bank of Toronto bills. Banks used to be able to print their own money, so we have a few of those bills in our collection, but don't know if they actually passed through this building. Very little to do with the history of where we're actually situated.
And I mean, no blueprints. We have contacted the Bank of Toronto archives in Toronto. They have, unfortunately, very little information for us concerning, the internal picture of this building. External, we have a few external photographs, but once again, nothing of the interior. And then Transcona municipal offices. Aside from those 3 photos that we found, we really don't have any photos of what it used to look like as a municipal office.
No, and there was a lot of different departments that worked out of here. People have come in and said, I used to pay my dog license here, or pay my water bill here, but public health was apparently upstairs. I think we have one sign that might be from when public health was here. Apparently at one point there was a secondhand clothing store in the basement. And this is all just, it's either oral history or it's not necessarily tangible. It's all that intangible history, but having some tangible artifacts to associate with that would be fantastic as well. And then the city of Winnipeg used this building too. We do have a few things that they gave to us when the museum first like moved into the building and stuff like that. But you know, sort of the history of this building essentially. Another area where we have, as far as we know, literally zero artifacts associated with it is any LGBTQ plus history and in the community of Transcona. As far as we're aware, within the collection, we don't have anything that represents LGBTQ plus, and that's archival or artifact wise. So that's definitely an area of history that's missing.
We mentioned technology from like the 1960s, 70s to present. We've gotten a few over the past like maybe year or two, like I'm thinking cell phones, but that's about it.
Yeah, we have some older televisions, not newer ones, not that we necessarily have a lot of room for televisions. Television, no examples of early computers that were used in Transcona. Anytime you've seen a computer on display at the museum, it's been the museum's own computer that we've put on display. Telephones, technology changes so rapidly too, but our technology aspects, what we have in the collection, is very pre-1960s.
And then kind of items in general from the 70s to the 2000s. We're missing quite a bit. We seem to just stop at the 70s.
Yeah, there's late 60s, early 70s. It's sort of when that initial collecting period was happening. From that point on, like we don't have much. If we have anything, it's typically within the archives. A few things here or there are artifact wise, but we're missing that. Another area where we have very limited items are items related to children and their history in the community. We have a few toys. Again, they're very dated, that we have in the collection. But children's toys, children's games, children's clothing, we have a few things, again, not many. So, you know, what life was like for children here in the community.
Another big one is 2747 history and photographs.
Yep. We just had someone ring the doorbell. So we know very little actually about the 2747, you know, as in where it was, the years it was in service and where it was in service and who worked on it and things like that. Very few photographs of the 2747 in our collection. So that's one area people have information. We have met people who know or had relatives who worked on the engine. One of our volunteers who helps out with the 2747 preservation project, he actually worked on the engine. So he's been a godsend, and he's donated a few things to us, but we definitely want to build up that history of the 2747. Another example is Transcona police records, or Transcona, that goes back to municipal records. So very little information about Transcona Police when it was its own separate police force. But again, also we don't have much when it was the Transcona Fire Department or municipal services that the city offered. We have very, very little when it comes to that. So that's one area. From when Transcona was a city. Definitely there's a big gap there. Contemporary history of Transcona. So what's currently going on, like Jennifer mentioned earlier, the whole pandemic, what are people doing during the pandemic? And you know, it isn't ending as fast as we all maybe thought it was going to. So it's, you know, continuing on, and how are we working through it? And that could be, you know, represented with a homemade mask that someone's made that they, you know, donate to the museum, or letters, or, you know, pictures that people have created during the pandemic, you know, things like that. So that's like the very now contemporary history of Transcona, but also 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, what was going on in the community what are those stories that we're missing that we need to tell? And I thought of another one that's not on our list here, but we have very little representation of the different groups of people that have lived in Transcona, even from the beginning to now. We know that there were Jewish people that lived here in Transcona, but we have almost nothing that represents the Jewish perspective. We have a little bit of a Ukrainian perspective, but a little bit of Polish, not much, but there was Irish and Scottish and German, and nowadays there's a Filipino and other groups and nationalities that live in our community which aren't represented here. And that's not necessarily what we want, because that's not telling the community spirit of our community, when it is, again, it's a very white centric collection that we have right now. White male perspective is a lot of what we have in our collection, and that is not what our community is. So we need to be adding these items to the museum so we can tell everybody's story, the community stories of Transcona.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so why are we missing these items?
That wasn't even like all of it. That was just like a drop in the hat of what we're missing, things we have identified.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, why do we have these gaps? So the collections here at the museum, they're made up of items that have been brought in or loaned to us over the years. It is not necessarily us going out and seeking these items. Some museums do have budgets for that. We do not.
Very few items in this museum's history have ever been purchased. We did purchase the 2747 for $1. I think a part of the collection was purchased, but very, very little of our collection has ever been purchased. It's been donated or, as Jennifer said, permanently loaned, which in that case, it doesn't really technically belong to the museum, those items.
A good example of this would be, so the Transcona shots, big, huge portion of Transcona's history. We are not the official CN archives, right?
No.
A lot of that stuff was given to other museums and archives in the country by CN itself. Mm-hmm. CN items that we do have or records were brought in by individual workers.
So we often get questions like, oh, do you have employment records or personnel records from the shops? And we do not. Unless someone specifically donated their apprenticeship papers, we don't have any other records like that. So we'll always, Science and Tech Museum in Ottawa has a lot of the CN archives. So we'll direct people that way. So again, it's just what the community has brought to us. So part of it could be who knows about the museum to know what to bring to to the museum. And then we also have that historical versus modern. A lot of times people think museum, they think only antique or really old artifacts or archival materials to bring to the museum. And that's not necessarily the case. We are collecting the current history as well. So that could be that's one of the reasons why we're missing some of these items. Or it could also be because the contemporary history, people maybe aren't necessarily willing to part with these items yet. Mm-hmm. They're, they have value to the individuals, and maybe in 20 years that's when we'll start seeing some of these items come to the museum. But it's oftentimes it's people, maybe a relative has passed away and they're going through items, a family member's passed away, someone is downsizing, and then that's where a lot of the conversations about wanting to donate things often start with here at the museum. Not always, but oftentimes that happens. But it's not necessarily, this is from 2 years ago. An exception to that was we did have Murdoch McKay's football team won a provincial championship a couple of years ago. And the football coach donated the game ball, a medal, and one of the jerseys to the museum to showcase that exciting part of like Murdoch McKay and the football, Murdoch McKay School and the football team's history. So that's here at the museum. But that's, you know, one of the most current sort of newer, more contemporary items that have been brought into the museum. And that was a number of years ago as well.
It also comes down to what items have survived over the decades. I mean, if people's basements flood out, or if there was a fire, or, you know, they just disintegrated over time or became lost, right? Mm-hmm. What we do have has managed to survive all these decades. So that could be a big portion of it too.
Yeah, like plastic doesn't last very long, as most people know, and so there, you know, that's an issue. Some of the plastic breaks down somewhat fairly quickly. There's a lot of things that are made out of plastic. It's hard for museums to probably care for a lot of plastic things. So maybe that was the thing, or, you know, going through old toys or games or something. Oh, that's missing pieces, you know. Not necessarily thinking of the museum as a place to donate things. Yeah, so it's just like what has survived that's come to the museum.
Another thing too is what is considered important to preserve. You know, what people were capturing, say, in photographs or documents, you know, 40, 50, 60 years ago, is perhaps different than what we would consider important to preserve now as researchers, right?
Well, that too, but also you had a roll of film. It only took 24 mm-hmm. photographs. So you didn't take 24 photographs of one thing. You took one photo to commemorate whatever event. And now with our smartphones or digital cameras, we can take multiple photographs and then save the best one. But oftentimes, I don't know if you're anything like me, I just have many photographs of the same thing because I haven't actually gone through and done that. And then, you know, digital too, that's a big thing that museums and archives are still learning and going through. Is digital doesn't necessarily last forever either, and it depends on the file type and the quality and things like that. And then we have a digital file, we need at least 3 backups of the file, because what if something happens over here and then over there? So that brings in its own set of challenges, having digital items, but it's doable as well. It's different than the actual physical thing as well.
I mean, as a researcher, I love it when there is information associated with something, right? You know, those stories or the history of, like, say, people's names on a photograph, right? Mm-hmm. That may not have been considered important to capture that type of information, right? But now that would be hugely important.
Yeah, there are many photographs in our collection where they've been donated, and they're wonderful photographs. We just have no idea who's in them, because perhaps when they were donated, the names weren't written on the back, or the person who's donating them maybe didn't necessarily know. We know it's of a Transcona event. Say, for instance, like the cenotaph unveiling. We know that's Transcona. We know it's an important event, but it'd be really great to know who some of the people in the photographs were. But then sometimes we have people who look through our old photos and they're able to identify people. So that's wonderful. And I don't know if any of you saw our presentation last week, where we looked at the negative collection from the Transcona newspaper, but that one was a treasure trove of information, because we actually had the newspapers to go to find out who was in them and what events were taking place and things like that. And because of that, we know so many more events and mm-hmm. can identify people. And someone who was watching the event last week saw her grandparents. Yeah, because they were in there. So, it's what's important to preserve, and we like to tell people it's not just the older history, it's the newer history that's happening as well. Mm-hmm.
So now, how can I donate my items to the Transcona Museum? Best thing is to book an appointment. You can call or email us. That way we have time to sit down with you properly and, look over these items, talk about their history, capture that information that is very important, the stories.
It's also important because not all staff can accept items into the collection. So currently it's just myself. So I have to be here to sign the paperwork or have given Jennifer authorization for a particular donation. So unfortunately, we have had people just show up, and if I'm not here, we don't allow things to be left here, because if someone just leaves something and says, oh, I'll come back later, it's happened before where nobody comes back. And then again, we're stuck, not stuck. We have these items in our collection that technically do not belong to us because they haven't been legally signed over to us. So we're stuck with them, having to care for them and treat them as we would any other artifact, but they do not belong to us.
I'll just sneak in here. I guess, why is it important that an artifact belong to the museum? Once again, it's time, it's resources to look after these items long term. It also comes into play when we have to, say, look at treatment options, like professional conservation treatment options for some artifacts. We have one artifact that we cannot ourselves properly treat, but because it's a loan, we can't have that treatment performed to it.
And we can't get permission from the loaner because he unfortunately died in the 70s, and we haven't been able to locate family to find out who the executor is to get permission. And it's a significant, having the item treated would be in its best interest. And we're sort of at an impasse at that point at this moment in time.
Mm-hmm.
So, you book your appointment, you call or email, we set up a time. That way too, you're not coming in when it's not going to happen right now, but we've had people come in when we've had a school group in. And so that group has booked their time. We're giving them a program and someone has come in to potentially donate something. And so we can't give, depending on staffing, we can't give them both the same amount of attention that they may need. So you book a time, that time is your time with us, the staff, so we can go through the items, and every item will be evaluated accordingly. We're going to look at its condition and the history on it. And if something is in very poor condition when it's being offered for donation, we have to think about, okay, what are we going to have to do to be able to store this correctly and preserve its life? Is it going to require treatment? Neither of us are conservators who can treat artifacts, so that would have to go to an outside conservator. We don't have one on staff, and that costs a significant amount of money. So as with all museums, our budgets are getting tighter and tighter. So we might not accept an item that needs significant conservation treatment because we just can't afford it. And again, ethically, are we doing the best for the artifact if we can't conserve it? So that's something that we look at. And then there is paperwork to complete for every artifact donation. And that paperwork is critical and key, because that is the official signing over of these items to the museum's collection. It's transferring ownership to the museum. And without that transfer of ownership, again, we're caring for something that is not ours.
It's in that weird limbo world.
Yeah. And like I mentioned earlier, I'm the only one who can accept items into the collection. So if I'm not here, that item won't be accepted. And it is our policy that items cannot be left here at the museum if I'm not here, unless a prior arrangement has been made and discussions have already occurred and things like that. But we do have people just come to the museum with items, and sometimes it works out and I'm here and it fits within things that we're accepting into the collection, and we can do that. And other times we have to turn people away.
Also too, some people have dropped off items, say photographs, in our mailbox before. That is great that you want this to be here at the museum, but once again, we still need that paperwork. We still need to sit down with you to capture information and history and all that.
Hopefully, if it's come in the mail, we have a mailing address we can mail back and start some conversations and get that paperwork signed. But we've also had anonymous doorstop donations, and all museums go through this, and it's a challenge. And we don't like them, is is essentially the case. And also right now, just because of COVID-19, we have different policies in place. We are very much restricting what we are accepting into the collection right now, because we are putting items through a quarantine. Yes. You may have had them in your garage or, set aside for a while, haven't touched them or anything like that, but then we are quarantining them as well, because we can't disinfect an artifact. If it's a letter that should go in our archives, we can't spray this down with disinfectant. That would ruin the letters. So we have to quarantine items. So we're quarantining them away from other artifacts in the collection, so things can't spread, things like that, because we can't disinfect our collection. So again, it's very important right now that if you are interested in donating something, that you do make that appointment, because we have accepted very few things since we reopened in June. And that's just because we have a lot of new measures that we have to do here, cleaning wise and everything like that every day. And we wanted to get used to our new normal before we started adding new items into the collection and figuring out truly the best way that we can care for these items, still keep them safe and still keep ourselves safe. Mm-hmm. So now it's your chance to ask us any questions. So you can use the chat function in Zoom, or you can just leave a comment on the Facebook Live, and we will do our best to answer them. Now there's about a 30-second delay with the Facebook Live, so we're just going to give it a couple moments. So if anyone has any questions, if you think of something afterwards, don't hesitate to email us, phone us, leave a comment on our Facebook page. This will also be uploaded to YouTube, so you can leave a comment on YouTube, and we'll do our best to answer your question and get back to you.
Oh, I love this one. What is the strangest item we've ever had someone attempt to donate?
Strangest item. That is a good one.
Now I'm trying to think of like strange as in it's just strange looking, or strange as in like,
I don't know. We've had,
This is a really good question.
I don't know what the strangest thing is. There's definitely been some strange situations that I've had happen, where I had someone come to the museum with a box of items and they just tried to hand it to me, and I said, no, come in. We have to fill out some paperwork and go through these things so I can get the history. And they said, no, I don't have time. And so I had to say, I'm sorry then. I can't take these if you're not willing to sign the paperwork. And they were not necessarily happy, but that is our policy.
And these are policies that are set in place by museum associations, like at the provincial level and the federal or national level.
But also our board of directors. Yep. Like, it's our policy that we follow. So, strangest artifact though.
I mean, someone tried to donate a fire truck.
I don't know if it was necessarily try to donate, but we were outside cleaning up weeds in front of the building, and someone yelled as they were driving by, "Hey, you want a fire truck?" And it was a volunteer who he was yelling at, and she's like, no, I can't. What? But again, it's a 4-way stop right by the museum, so people aren't really there for very long. But that was probably the oddest. Someone just yelling as they were driving by if we wanted a fire truck.
Great question.
Yeah.
Send us more. Ask us more.
But again, as I was mentioning, we're going to upload this to YouTube as well. So you can, let's do the like and subscribe so you can see our videos. And pretty much all of our other small talks have been uploaded to YouTube as well. You can watch ones that went to Facebook Live on our Facebook page, but also you can see them on our YouTube channel. And we've been doing these small talks since like doing them virtually since the start of the pandemic in early April. So there's a number of them that you can go through. Oh, another question.
What would you say are some of the wow items in your collection, ones that are most impressive or that draw upon the most curiosity?
I know my favorite artifact, and it's because it's very odd. We have a fetal beluga whale in a jar. It's
you gotta tell the full story of how it got here.
Well, that's also a bit of a, I have best determined that it came with the Cecil Patterson collection, which is our archaeological collection. And that collection toured around schools after it was initially purchased by the Transcona Springfield School Division. And then it was brought to the museum here, loaned, but to be a place where the schools could access it and we could teach about Indigenous histories and about the collection. And at that time, it came with the fetal beluga whale in a jar. And my best guess is it just kind of got mixed in with the Patterson collection because there's no other reference to a fetal beluga whale in a jar. But I do remember when I was in elementary school, the science room had a whole section of different animals in jars. So I think it somehow got mixed in there. But it is my favorite artifact in the collection because it is so much of a head scratcher.
I mean, in terms of like history, I really love the first mayor's chair. And it basically crisscrossed this country since 1912, and it came here in like what, 2000?
2 years ago? 3 years ago?
2018? Yeah. So I mean, and it's in really great condition, and it's the first mayor of Transcona's chair. To me, that's really wow.
Another artifact that I like is we have a painter's box that was used by a gentleman who worked at the Transcona shops, but he had initially lived in England. And when he was in England, because he was a painter for the railroad, he knew how to paint the Royal Crest by heart. So I believe it was the 1939 Royal Tour that was taking place across Canada, Transcona at the shops, they were the ones who prepared the train, I guess. And he was given a crest to paint on it for like the Royal Crest to paint on. And it was wrong. It was incorrect. It was not the right one. So he painted the actual one from memory. But we have his painter's box filled with brushes and gold foil and
it's on display right now, actually.
Yeah, and it's currently on display, and I really love that one as well.
I'm trying to think of other ones. I mean, I'm a geek. I love maps. Maps are great. Early Transcona maps.
I really love the negative collection we have from the Transcona News. A lot of our old photographs that show the community of Transcona, and something that I really like, and it's not necessarily a wow, but this one really touches me, is we have from the Transcona War Efforts Committee, so during World War II, we have a collection of letters and cards that soldiers wrote back to the War Efforts Committee, thanking them for sending them care packages and things like that. And to see in their own words, when they really couldn't say much, because a lot of them say, everything's fine, we're doing good, when you know, you weren't, and you were in war, but they couldn't say anything. And some of them have actually been censored, so things have been cut out of them. That's, to me, a very special collection, because some of those are we have cards from individuals who were killed in action a few months later. So is that one of the last times that they wrote something home? So we have it in our collection.
Yeah, varying levels of wow, and like, you know, wow for different types of themes and topics and collections. So.
Yeah, we have like one that's really interesting is the very first wedding that took place in the city of Transcona. We have that wedding dress along with photographs of that wedding. So that one is special because it's telling that history and story of the first wedding happening in the city of Transcona. We don't necessarily accept a lot of wedding dresses in our collection, but that one is significant, and so we have it.
Oh, that medicine bottle that came out of the wall in just outside of Transcona.
Yeah, this gentleman was doing renovations in his house, and he found this glass medicine bottle, perfect shape. It had been walled up, and it came from Still's drugstore, which was just down the road from where we are. And but it's doctor's handwriting, so we're trying to figure out the name of the doctor and trying to figure out what the prescription was for. But why was this bottle put in a wall and walled up? We never got that answer, and but it was in really good condition. So that one was quite special, and we sort of fell down a rabbit hole trying to figure that one out.
We do have a question, follow up. Who was the first marriage?
Off the top of my head, I cannot remember. I would have to look that up in our database. I can see the pictures in my head and I can see the dress, but unfortunately I don't know that off the top of my head. I'll have to respond later after the talk is done, and I'll respond on Facebook to that because I don't know off the top of my head. And we've had it on display before. Mm-hmm. I just don't recall the name.
What would you say is the number one thing on your list, something that you've been dreaming of having in the collection?
Oh, for me, it's women's World War II uniforms. That's what I want. We have one. We have representations of Army, Navy, and Air Force for men, but we don't have any for women. And we have newspaper articles and photographs of women who served, but that's a key thing that I would really like to add to the collection.
Now, this is like, it doesn't exist, but I would love to have it. During the 20s, Transcona did not produce a newspaper. The town went bankrupt. So there is no newspaper that was produced from like 1918 to 1931. That is a gap that we will never fill because, once again, there was no newspaper. But I would so love it if there was.
Or if someone sort of kept notes of what was going on in the community, because at that time there was no town or city council either, because the town went bankrupt. So the province was administering the town. So there's not even like minutes we can go back to. So that would be sort of a history of what was going on in those years would be really great. Also, because the newspaper kind of cuts out 1917, 1918, we don't know the impact of the Spanish influenza here in Transcona. What was it like? What happened? What measures were put in place in this community? That would be something that would be really great to know.
There was a bank robbery that happened here in 1930. We have the information from Winnipeg newspapers, but not from Transcona, because once again, no newspaper.
Or if there was a newspaper in production, we don't have it in our collection. So if there are any sort of missing newspapers from Transcona, sort of 1918 to 1931, 31 or 31 is definitely what we would like.
But I mean, that's like if I dream a genie that into existence. Something actually tangible would be like images of the interior of this building when it was a bank and the municipal office, because that would just be great for our history.
Even any building, any store in Transcona, we have, I think, there's some interior shots of Robert's Drugstore and a couple interior shots of Blostein's, but that's it. Like, there was numerous stores over the years. What did they look like inside? There was a billiards hall. What did the billiards hall? What did the Queen's Court Bucket of Blood bar look like? We don't have any photographs, so we don't know.
Oh, I want to add to this too. Early South Transcona history.
South Transcona history. Yeah.
Yes. I do know that there was a hotel and billiards hall and pool rooms and, a lot of stuff boomed, but because of the First World War and then the Spanish influenza and the bankruptcy, it didn't boom as much as it did here on this side of the shops. So like capturing images or just more history, more of that early history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's another gap in our history is South Transcona history. Definitely. That is another gap that we have because that community is part of this community. It feels very separated because of the shops and then Dugald Road, but having more of South Transcona's history would definitely be, it would help tell that story.
I could just keep adding to this one.
Yeah,
this
was a good
question. Yeah. I'm going to throw in one more. Okay. Early Transcona cemetery records or early, like an image of the early Transcona cemetery.
Oh, that church that was there before the cemetery was built. That was the Southwind.
The Southwind Presbyterian Church.
We have a sketch from a book. That's the only image we have of it. So, yeah, there's a lot.
There's a lot. And if we keep thinking about it, we'll think of more and more and more.
Something dreaming. Yeah. And more stories of women who worked at the shops. What it was like for them. Oh, and
see, keep going and going.
There was a cordite plant just east of Transcona during World War II where they made cordite and nitroglycerin for Allied forces. Now there was a newspaper newsletter that was made in-house, and we have copies of that. But also, like, we have one artifact. Well, three. We have 3 artifacts from the cordite plant. One piece of the fence that was there, a sign that was on the fence, and a hammer that was used, made out of a particular metal because it wouldn't spark.
Brilliant.
Because you don't want sparks around cordite and nitroglycerin. But, you know, overalls that someone wore, women definitely worked there. And so clothing that a woman wore when she worked there, you know, again, a lunch kit. There was a baby born on site. Just like the mother was in labor, went to the site to get the husband so they could go to the hospital and didn't make it. So they made it as far as the cordite plant. But, you know, more stories about the cordite plant. But the cordite plant was kind of top secret. You weren't supposed to talk about it because it was making munitions for the war effort. So a lot of people maybe didn't save those things, or they were told not to talk about it, so they didn't talk about it. That's more of what I would want as well.
We're going to turn back to you. Do you have any more questions that we can just go on about? Because honestly, we could for a long time. We love talking about this.
Yeah, there's some really cool stuff in our collection. Oh, one more.
That's great. Thank you. Oh, you're very welcome.
So I think that's what we have. If you're watching this after we've done our live, leave a comment on Facebook, leave it on the YouTube comments, and we'll get to you as soon as we can, and we'll get back and hopefully able to answer them. Send us an email, a DM, whatever, if you have any questions.
So in terms of upcoming small talks, because this is the last one of the summer series, we are planning some new ones for the fall, and topics will include updates to popular talks we may have given in the past, as well as new content, new talks that we're developing. But we also want to hear from you, our listeners. What kind of topics would you like to hear? Let us know. Once again, you can email us. You can, comment to this small talk. Just let us know.
Yeah, what would you like to learn more about? And we'll do our best.
Yeah.
So once again, thank you for taking time to participate in our small talk today. And again, we'll just ask you to support the Transcona Museum, so you can make a donation or become a museum member, and that's available on our website. You can visit our website to find out what's going on. Follow us on social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and our blog. Join our mailing list where we send out e-newsletters. Just any of those little things help support the museum. And this is a trying time, and we're doing our best to get through it with our new normal. Yeah. So thank you again, and please join us again in the fall for our next series of small talks. And updates and information will be on our website, on social media, and our e-newsletter once we've set our plan for the upcoming talks and the dates, so on and so forth for those. So if you have an idea of something you'd like to hear about in a small talk, let us know in the comments below, however you're watching this, and we'll do our best to see if we can incorporate that. Okay?
Thank you.
Bye.